Okay, DT. So let's jump into our third section, which is the psychological, social, and biological
Yes.
foundations for behavior. So with this section, sometimes it throws students off because of the volume of the reading. Now, this
Yes.
was very big during shelf exams for the psych shelf exams during, third year clerkships. One of the reflections that many of our classmates had was, man, those psych boards, those psych shelf exams are hard. And the reason why they're hard is because the passages are so dense. They are
Yes.
so concentrated with information. And with psych, you have to be very careful because sometimes you have to take into consideration the time frame, the chronicity of the presenting illness. And so there's different factors that allows you to be able to go to what you know from the DSM and be able to qualify what this disease is, right? And so with that being said, what is your teaching techniques around how we jump into this section?
That's a very good point, DJ. So the first piece to understand, this is like a coming attraction, as you just shared, for what you're going to experience in your medical training
Right.
when you're doing deep dives into behavioral health. And so having a good handle on the psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior for the MCAT, against a coming attraction of what we're going to see in medicine. So the goal is really to break down the passage, if you will, into three key areas. And I always like to emphasize these three key areas are, first, think about the theory. What is the behavioral theory that's being emphasized here? Is it operant conditioning, or classic conditioning as an example, right? So if you have the classic conditioning theory, what are terms with which you should be familiar under that theory, because you're going to not only have to know what they are, but you're going to be expected to apply it, right? So that's where we might have operant reinforcement as one exemplar in that area. And then lastly, once you have considered, hey, what's the key behavioral theory? What are key behavioral terms I will now integrate with that theoretical underpinning? Then how do I apply that in a particular situation? Because that passage is going to require you to do that. That may be the patient scenario that's coming up. So if we were thinking about, let's say, a scenario of a child that is having a context of positive reinforcement around some particular area with the parents are trying to do positive reinforcement, then do we understand the differences between positive versus negative reinforcement, the potential outcomes associated with that, and what is the overarching theory that is at play, right?
Right.
So again, we can take a look at a passage and some questions and see how the MCAT is masterful in going across those four levels of thinking, as well as, of course, the consideration of the key foundational concepts that may be around behavioral theories, key behavioral terms, and then our ability to understand them and use them in a real life situation.
So we have theories, we have terms, and then applications to like
Yes.
real life scenarios. And this brings me back again to my third year clerkship, because when we were trying to learn a lot of these diagnoses, let's just even take personality disorders, it was, we see that relating some of these terms to real life scenarios, that kind of reinforces the definition or reinforces the context or the theory. If you're looking at histrionic personality disorder or obsessive compulsive personality disorder, not OCD, but OCPD.
That's right.
Yeah, that's an inside joke.
I like that. That's right.
What you're doing is, in your preparation, you're kind of linking it to maybe an example in media, or, so we would take all these personality disorders and whoever we felt in pop culture displayed histrionic disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, we would link those characters so it could stick into our mind, not the theory, the term, and then the application process of how it would present in our patient on, exam day when we see the patient in the room, or on test day when we see it in the vignette.
That's so important because this goes back to how our brain likes to learn. And we call that, in fancy educational term, informational encoding. When we can take information and link it to some real world experience, the brain encodes it in a different way for long-term memory, but equally important, for ease of retrieval. So informational encoding and retrieval systems are very important in our learning process because it allows us to be more confident that we have mastered the information, and mastery requires key associations for long-term encoding. So when we need it, we can then retrieve it in a meaningful way. But those two processes are only the starting point. Afterwards, we still got to think.
And it's not a passive
still have to
process.
think.
It's not
That's
a passive
right. It's
process.
active.
It's an active process that you're doing. You go into the neurological in terms of how do we consolidate, our information that we're learning on a day-to-day basis in school into our memory. And it depends on many different areas of the brain and many different functions. How does your frontal cortex work in your consolidation of your memory? How does different hormones affecting different parts of your brain affect your mood, which then talks about how you consolidate information into your brain? And so with that being said, let's look at how a passage works. Now I'm looking at the passage. This is a way smaller passage than I'm used to from a psychological standpoint, like on the shelf exams, but let's just kind of read this and see what we find in terms of our skills, applying our skills.
Yes. And one of the things before you proceed is that we find that on the MCAT, we have short passages, which could be a paragraph to a paragraph and a half. Some people call them mini, MINI passages. And then we have long passages, which can be 3 to 4 paragraphs long. On average, your passages are a minimum of 2.5 paragraphs long at a minimum. So for our illustrative purposes for facilitated session, we intentionally chose some of these shorter passages in the interest of time so that we can make the points about foundational concepts and, of course, the skills that are needed in these 3 science sections that we've been focusing on. When we do the deep dive AME mastery courses for MCAT success, we then use the long passages that we grow you towards. We start you off with some of these short passages, intermediate passages, and then longer passages as you gain mastery over execution of your skills and strategy and attacking the actual passages and questions.
Sounds like exposure CBT, if you ask
It
me.
is. It is. That's right. That's exactly what it is. And through that process, not only are you being desensitized to what can be academically intimidating, but you are being nurtured for success, and your confidence is building and you're executing on the skills. And now you embrace, I want to do all these dense passages because I know how to navigate them.
Right. And that
I
became-
know how to navigate them. Going back to our scholar who put that on the social media early on the interweb about how do we navigate these dense passages. It's a process. And again, coaching is typically involved in this process, and it's okay to have coaching. For every 10 students that we encounter in our AME support of student success, about 3 students out of 10 do not require long-term coaching. They actually require just a tune-up, and they can do it on their own. And that's absolutely wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. Another 5 out of 10 scholars require intermediate levels of coaching, maybe 2 to 5 sessions, and then they can self-direct the process. Now, I'll just be honest. I may be an expert facilitator, but quite frankly, back in the day, I'm in the last category. About 2 out of 10 scholars need regular recurring coaching to build the skills in terms of thinking and understanding, but also to build the confidence in doing that process.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with doing that either. And so if you are a scholar in any of those 3 categories, we invite you, if you need assistance, check us out in the DM, send us a note, and we'll respond and we'll be working with you.
Yeah. So with that being said,
Question time.
you want to jump into the question?
Yes.
All right. So I'll read. So a developmental psychologist observes a group of children. When a student completes a math problem correctly, the teacher gives verbal praise. Great job.
We can stop right there. So as soon as we see that whole verbal praise, we are already beginning to think about, oh, is this a type of reinforcement? We're with children. We know children need encouragement. I'm thinking about what's the theory, right? What's the theory that's coming, okay?
Right. And the child works more enthusiastically. When a student talks out of turn, the teacher withholds praise.
Stop there. Look at the 2 different scenarios, right? So are we trying to, so remember, we are in psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior. And we are trying to, in essence, cultivate a certain behavior of children. We don't know what age they are, but it's intimated that clearly these children are going to be younger children, right? And so we're trying to cultivate certain behaviors, right? By giving praise when there is execution and completion of a task. And if we're outside of that process, to withhold the praise to see if we can get compliance. Now, does that work or not? We'll see.
We'll see. So over several weeks, praised children complete more problems. Unpraised children talk less. In interviews, praised children report feeling included. Rarely praised children feel isolated.
So now the stage is set. This is not about, and it's very important because we all have had this experience, right? You could read some passages in the psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior and find yourself wandering away from the passage and thinking about an experience that happened to you.
You get triggered. The passage is triggering you.
Exactly. So it's very important to stay focused on the passage because you're about to be asked questions related to the passage, not about your own journey.
Right.
That's just a little sidebar to remember that. Because I could see this, and as I was hearing you read it, I was thinking about my own journey and what different teachers did, etc. Right?
Right.
Okay, let's go to the first question.
So the first question is, which principle explains increased math completion amongst praised children?
All right, so here we go. There's a principle, as we said, we went back to theories, terms, application. So principle aligns with a theory because where principles associated with a theoretical context. And again, the context here specifically is math completion, with children. But in essence, this can be a skill 1 in terms, do I understand and know what type of reinforcement works? Or it could be even an early skill 2. Well, have you reason through the passage to understand what type of actual principle is at play here based on the actions that are occurring, right? All right, DJ, because you're the scholar, I don't know anything. Where are we going with this question? So what principle do we believe is explains the increased math completion among praised children?
So I would go with A, positive reinforcement.
All right. Now, there's quite a lot of evidence for that, as we saw at the end of the passage that noted what happened with the outcome, right, of the kids, right? And then we had the proxy language, praise versus not praise. So again, we can very quickly begin to look at A and B both have reinforcement. We could say, but what type of reinforcement? We knew that was positive, so A was looking good. So not likely B. That could have been immediately impeached. We still should watch for C and D. Where there's actually punishment? Relative. Is withholding praise punishment? It's relative. And then habituation, you may say, I'm not even sure what that term means.
Right.
but was it even introduced in the passage? So if not, we don't know what it means. It wasn't introduced. We could impeach D for that reason. Not introduced. Number one, you didn't see anything related to that, or you don't know what it is, so you can't choose something you don't know. When you have confidence about one that makes sense, you never choose one you don't know or that was not mentioned.
Right.
We can impeach it for that reason. But look at the qualifier is because we have one that aligns what we're thinking. We're doing verification. And then between A and C, A seems to be the most appropriate answer based on how it was framed in the context. Right. And when praise was withheld, it wasn't anything else in terms of an actual level of what would be perceived as punishment. It just was withheld. So let's see how you did, DJ. And once again, you're on point. Skill, and there's the smile again. And it's skill one, as we said, because it's basically, do we understand the concept of positive reinforcement?
Right.
And now remember that we're in the psychological, social, and biological foundation of behavior. We should see foundational concepts 6 through 10. There are 5 foundational concepts, 6 through 10, associated with this section, and they give us foundational concept 7A. Let's do another question.
Okay. So the question number 2 is withholding praise for talking out. Which principle? So we have
It's interesting.
another list of kind of definitions. So A, positive reinforcement, B, extinction, C, classical conditioning, and D, discrimination learning.
Which option can you immediately impeach?
So I'm going to immediately impeach A.
We would immediately impeach option A because how can something being withheld, in this case, withholding praise, how can that be positive reinforcement per se based on the passage, right? We can get into some complex behavioral situations later on in medical school where that could potentially be the answer. But right now, we're on the MCAT, and based on that passage, that can be immediately impeached also based on your understanding of what we shared in the previous question, right?
Right.
So a lot of times with these questions, you have 4 options. Typically, one of those 4 can be immediately impeached, which moves you from a probability of a 1 in 4 or 25% chance of getting that question right to a 1 in 3, immediately moving to a 33% probability. Probability goes up very quickly as we impeach options, right?
Right. So I would then impeach D. So
All right.
discrimination learning, because we already discussed how withholding praise is not necessarily the punishment. Or going back to our first facilitated session here, when we talked about environmental error. So,
But there's nothing learning about
it's
it. There's
nothing
nothing
learning.
being taught in terms of the learned process of math.
Right.
So, even with, if we take off the discrimination piece for a second, look at learning, well, what is being learned? Is it a particular behavior that should be learned? But the learning that was happening was the math behavior, right? The math was the content that was being learned, and the behavior that was being reinforced. Continue to practice your math when I give you positive praise. So this learning doesn't seem to map up with, okay, withholding the praise is actual discrimination learning. Right? Okay, so impeach for that reason. All right, so you're down to what we call the 50-50.
50-50.
Yeah, a 1 in 2 shot of getting this correct.
So I'm just going to go with C, classical conditioning.
All right.
And
what are we trying to condition?
So what we are conditioning is, if you talk out, then you are not going to receive praise.
That is correct. If you talk out, you're not going to receive praise, and everyone wants to receive praise. We also found that the praise is associated with actual math outcomes. Now, there's a couple of funny things going on here. There's like a life lesson for teachers, is that withholding praise is not always a good outcome, because now you can affect students' motivation to learn.
Right.
But this question is not asking about that. See that? So we got to be careful. This question is not asking about that, because we did see students who are not praised, they do not continue to excel in terms of their academics. So the praise has to be structured in a way to encourage everyone. But that's not what's being asked here.
Yeah.
The
So
behavior was, in essence, don't talk out of turn or you won't be praised, right? What about extinction? Do we know what extinction is? Just think about what that word means.
I mean, I know what the word extinction means, but within this context, you know, I'm like I said, I'm a few years removed from the MCAT, so I don't know if it has a specific meaning here. And just thinking about my connection to the psychological sciences, it could be one of those. It could be an answer. So you
In
know,
terms of you want to stop a behavior.
yeah.
In other
So
words, withholding the praise,
yeah
I
is
stop the behavior of speaking out of turn.
yeah. So you know, I guess off you know just answering the question off bat, classical conditioning seemed reasonable to me because it's kind of like you're conditioning the people who do what you need, the students that do what you need, they get praise.
So that's
But then
the full context
yeah,
of the
but then the
passage.
students that don't do what is appropriate in class, appropriate classroom behavior, then you withhold praise. And so for me, I'm like, is that classical conditioning? But what you just mentioned before about, you know, looking at that word classical conditioning, and is that answering the question? And so when you get down
They
to
did
that
ask for
50
which
50,
principle.
yeah.
Conditioning, that may refer to potentially a principle. Is extinction a principle?
It is. So, I mean, with
This is
extinction,
challenging, isn't it?
yeah, so this one is a little challenging
Or is
because
conditioning more a theory? I wonder what the difference is between a theory and a principle. Red alert. I think we're in the vortex. So this
I'm
is what
definitely
could
in the vortex.
happen, right, on exam day. Sometimes we get so focused when it's time to choose 50-50 so we can go into a vortex. So we have to have an exit strategy. Now, exit strategy here is initially one will have a first impression between two options. That first impression may be linked to your understanding of the passage that was given to you. We go with that first impression and we exit because sometimes the questions are going to be challenging where two of the options seem reasonably correct, but we have to make a decision. And if we get it right, great. If we get it wrong, then we will learn what was it that allowed us to choose or that would make the other option more appropriate. Right? We'll learn that from the explanation. So, which one do you want to choose? And then we'll see
I knew that
if
was
you were
coming.
100%.
Listen, I'm gonna go with
Or
my
you
gut.
could defer to our studio audience. We'll let them put it, down in the DMs, and we can read about it later, and we'll just go to the answer. We could do that too.
Well, as much as I don't want to mess up my good record, I think I'm 2 for 2 right now. I'm just going to choose my first choice,
All right.
which is classical conditioning.
Well, it turns out that it's going to be extinction. But scholars, this is what it's all about, is that we have to still, that's why we practice, right? We practice to now understand that extinction is a key principle because we're trying to remove, right? Remove the reinforcement, which is the praise. And so that's part of an understanding of that term. Now, you and I didn't work this out. We were just doing this all for fun, right? It just turns out that's one. It was very closely related, but we had to look at what the key term and understanding of that term is. And again, classical conditioning going really back to a core theory that encompasses different types of principles. So this is good practice. That's skill 2, reasoning and problem solving. Again, concept 7B. But this is why we practice, because in certain areas of our sciences, there are closely related terms, and we have to tease out our understanding of why one is a better answer than the other in terms of its purpose and context. All right. Let's just very quickly look at the third question. Children's feelings illustrate what? So again, we are very quickly moving to the context of skill 3, because now in terms of the skills, if you were designing some process again around research, this teacher created a context around learning. So of course she's creating a sense of belonging by giving praise to those who execute on their math problems. Again, we can see all the skills at bay. And then question 4, which is critical for causality in an experiment. Ooh, look here. Causality in the experiment. Look at these terms that we have to understand before we can answer that question. That's going to be skill 4 as proxy, because we're looking at potential data outcomes associated with that, which is why they put it in the skill 4. So DJ, again, this is the third science section, but we're seeing a trend across all the science sections, which is mastery not only of the foundational concepts, but the understanding, but mastery of the thinking skills, and then continuing practice allows us to optimize success on the MCAT.
Very powerful. So this leads us to our fourth section. So we just discussed our 3 science foundation sections that are on the medical college admission test. So now let's jump into the CARS section. So the critical analysis and reasoning skills.